Buongiorno and welcome to the Author's Preface, a show where we explore how authors are forged. My name's Sam Hale. Thanks for joining me once again. So what's good with me? Not a whole lot. Working on a kind of in-between pod as I edit interviews with guests. It takes a while, I realized. I'd like to provide a bit more content for folks and also just share a few thoughts and my experience as a writer. Hopefully some digestible bits. I don't intend but I said the same thing about a 1,200 page book being relatively short. I don't intend for them to be longer than about 5 minutes, maybe a bit more. Reason being, I want things to be pretty digestible. You can just check out pod on habits, for example. That's one I have planned. Get the goods, or at least what I think might be worth listening to, and then check out. I enjoy listening to longer interviews with really great authors sharing their thoughts and experience, but I kind of lose the thread after that 10, 15-minute mark. I don't know what that says about me. So the goal is to have these out in between every couple pods. Got a nice list. Lessons I've learned the hard way, failing forward. That's actually one of the topics for an upcoming pod. Going to take a couple weeks. I'm trying to figure out the format. I plan on having a bit more production in them as well. We'll see how that goes. I'm looking forward to it. It's just a nice aside because I know it takes a while to get these interviews out. I'm really looking forward to it, and I hope you enjoy it. Just like I enjoyed speaking with my guest today, Joshua Scott Edwards. So who is Josh? Josh is a fantasy, sci-fi, and horror author. Most notable work being An Ocean of Others, his debut epic fantasy novel. D&D inspired, and you'll get plenty of that today. It is about a ragtag crew unraveling the mystery behind reality-bending monsters that emit auras of strong emotion. Really enjoyed reading it. As a D&D player myself, I got to see the influence and really enjoyed it. Seeing Josh's interpretation, or I guess novelization, of a D&D campaign he'd been enjoying with friends. Also author of Grave of the Waiting. It's a serialized sci-fi horror series he publishes on his website, following a crew of scientists and engineers who travel from a dying Earth to a rogue planet that mysteriously appeared in the solar system. Education. Josh has a master's degree in electrical engineering. He shares some of his electrical engineering prowess when I asked him what drum triggers are, because Josh has been playing drums for about 20 years and is actually a drummer in the metal band Gravelord. Pretty awesome. Somebody who really enjoys his metal. I had a good time listening to it. We talked about some of the influence, maybe some of the Easter eggs that might have found their way into his work. I know I do a lot of that with some of the metal bands I listen to, like Meshuggah. Really into gaming as well. Dark Souls and Elden Ring. We talk about Elden Ring as well, and trying to decipher George Martin's influence since he contributed to the story. Josh's links, you can find him at joshe.com. So that's just Josh, followed by the letter E.com, his website, where you can find out more about An Ocean of Others, Grave of the Waiting, and of course, Josh and upcoming novels. He's one of those guys who tracks progress. I admire that. I don't understand how people are able to do that. My brain don't function like that. What do we talk about in today's show? Josh is really, I'm going to use the word cute, motivation for starting his first book. It has to do with his now wife and their first date. I'm kind of a romantic at heart, so I really enjoyed that. We talk about comparison and its contextualization. I won't spoil it, but I loved the way Josh put comparison, and if you are going to do it, who to inflict it upon. And of course, D&D 5e, because like we both discussed in the pod, we are plebs. Don't get that 3e version or 3.5. Don't know what that's about. A lot of fun. If you're not a D&D fan, I hope maybe this gets you into it. Regardless, I think people will get a lot out of this. Josh had a lot of salient points. He's very well-spoken, level guy, and I really enjoyed talking with him. We have a ton of fun. This was amongst all the guests I've had, and I've enjoyed speaking with all of them. This is the hardest I've geeked out with a guest. We had a blast. They say, one pod for you, one for me. This one felt like pod for everybody. And I hope you enjoy listening to Joshua Scott Edwards' preface. Let's get right to it. All right. So I am here with Joshua Scott Edwards. Josh, thanks for joining me today, man.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for inviting me on.
Of course. I've been looking forward to this. You and I think I say this with all my guests, but I truly mean it. And I always mean it, but I extra mean it with you. Looking at your preface, over the last few days and just kind of preparing, doing research, creepy research on you, all that stuff. I'm like, man, this guy's got it dialed in. I want to hang out with this dude. So there's a lot of cool stuff we're going to talk about, but want to talk about yourself real quick for folks who don't have a chance to check it out at the top of the show where I give a more detailed breakdown of who you are. Why don't you just give people the rundown, the Cliff Notes version of who you are, your work, the genre, all that good stuff.
Sure. So I'm Joshua Scott Edwards. That's the name written on the books, but you can just call me Josh. My mom's the only one who calls me Joshua when she's upset. Yeah, I'm the author of An Ocean of Others. That's my debut epic fantasy. Came out last September. It's a D&D inspired adventure story about a ragtag crew unraveling the mystery behind these reality bending monsters. In the middle of writing the second book in that series right now. I'm close to finishing the first draft. I'm super excited. It's gonna expand in scope and just be like everything I wanted to do with this story in terms of getting more character focused and really just expanding the world. So super excited for that. Look out for that early next year, probably. I've also got Grave of the Waiting, which is a sci-fi story that is a serial that I've been publishing just on my website, kind of experimental, but that one's pretty crazy about like virtual reality and first contact and a mathematician with perfect memory who's haunted by the trauma that she went through during the war that she was a kid for. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. That one's on hiatus right now, though. But if you want to read it, I encourage you to. It's going to come out as a full book eventually. That's the beginning of a long journey.
Yeah, like with most writers, it's a long, arduous journey. It's kind of like a D&D quest, but it's worth it. We'll see.
And it doesn't get canceled halfway through because people couldn't schedule.
It's the worst. Let's figure out how you've leveled up throughout your writer's journey here. So we'll jump right into it. All right, Josh. So prior to writing, were you fulfilled in life? Did you feel like you were in a good spot? Was there sort of a writer shaped hole in you? What was your life like prior to writing?
Yeah, so that has been most of my life. I really only discovered my passion for writing and for reading really late during college, and for writing as after college. Like I'd read a lot of fantasy books as a kid, like Harry Potter and Redwall, but eventually I was like 13 and I just like fell off a cliff. I never read a single book. Like I hated reading for English class and everything. Only looking back do I actually appreciate what stories they made me read in school. But what changed it was in college, I got super obsessed with A Song of Ice and Fire, thanks to, of course, the Game of Thrones TV show. I would just get lost in kind of diving into the subreddits and reading all the wacky theories. Some of them are absolutely insane, and other ones are so well written that like they could be published books in their own right. I'm still waiting on all the theories to come true in the next book, which is definitely coming, I'm sure. But yeah, that's kind of what really got me interested in writing. I loved all the world building and all the characters, and I just wanted to do that for myself. I had so many ideas just kicking around, especially with just world building. So I started there with world building, like many authors, just writing those stories and getting lost in the world and making a map and everything. It put me in a flow state, like just sitting there and writing. And I pay attention to those moments because like when time seems not to exist and you're just undistractable and you're lost in the pages, that to me is like the definition of meaningful. And, you know, we're all looking for what we're here on this earth to do. And it really felt like this is one of the many things that I'm here to do. Like the only other one I can think of off the top of my head is drumming, and I've been doing that for 20 years now. So I don't think I'll be stopping my writing anytime soon. So fingers crossed. I've got a long career ahead of me. I'm sure I'll be writing long after I retire from my day job.
So I wanted to talk about, and maybe I'm jumping the shark here, but for people who aren't aware, you're a drummer in a metal band called Grave Lord, which I've had the privilege of listening to. It's pretty solid. I heard Meshuggah in there, Within the Ruins, Born of Osiris. I heard some among others there, and I really dug the sound.
Yeah, that's a lot of our influences there.
Yeah, and it's those are great choices. I mean, I'll listen to Meshuggah all day, every day.
Same.
I was listening to him yesterday, actually. I'm still trying to figure out what I think about the latest album. I like about 3 or 4 tracks, but as a whole, I still think Catch 33 is their best album, which So that's some controversy alert there for some people. They'll always say it's Obscene. I get it. Obscene has the best tracks, but as a concept, Catch 33 is their best album.
Oh yeah, there's something just raw about early Meshuggah. You
Mm-hmm.
just gotta admire it. They were like how like in their 20s putting out these
Yeah.
mind bending things. They changed the industry, man.
Yeah, people don't realize that too. Like Meshuggah's been around since the late 80s.
Yeah.
You know, like all some of their most seminal stuff didn't even come out until the early 2000s though. They've just been grinding for decades, and I mean they're older dudes. It's funny to look at Thomas Hauke. I learned how to pronounce his
Yeah.
last name. It's Hauke, and Thomas is, I mean, he looks like an older dude, but he is arguably one of the best
I
drummers,
know.
not just in metal but like just in general. He's an incredible drummer,
He
man.
makes it look so effortless. And then he's doing these things I'll like air drum along to, and I get tired doing that.
No, he's doing like three different time signatures simultaneously, while at the same time, just he has his left foot on the hi hat, just keeping time. I'm like, how are you doing any of this? Isn't fair. This isn't fair. So I wanted to talk about this because I put a lot of metal references. Meshuggah in particular, I have like "In Death Is Life" and "Death Is Death," all kinds of stuff in there. I think I even referenced the Kolos.
Oh,
Yeah, it's
nice.
Kolos. All kinds of stuff in there. Demiurge. So I was reading your book and I saw that you had said something to the effect that I'm messing it up, but the lightning something cracked the sky. And I was like, is that a Mastodon reference?
I don't think it was, but now that you're saying that, I instantly recognized it.
Yeah. I read it and I was like, all right. Do you have any intentional allusions to metal bands or anything like that?
I don't think I have any metal references. I tend to be like pretty sparse with like pop culture references and like Easter eggs and stuff. The story Grave of the Waiting, which probably no one has read, is is actually based on my own band, like Grave of the Waiting, Grave Lord.
Mm-hmm.
The 5 characters that we follow are based on each of the band members, very loosely.
That is awesome.
My our front man's name is Mario, and I've got he's a evolutionary biologist in the story called Marlowe. So
Yeah.
I was like, all right, just change the I to an L, and it's a new character.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's tons of references to my band in that story. I don't know if that counts though, because no one really knows us.
It totally counts. It's a metal band. It absolutely counts. So I wanted to talk about that, and we'll kind of get into when we talk about inspiration. I suspect we'll be talking about D&D, which we'll spend a couple hours talking about that one. But when I listen to a lot of metal in particular, and they're doing concept albums, you can tell that somebody sat down and wrote a story and then wrote the album. And then even like a lot of prog bands like Coheed and Cambria, every single album is based on their graphic novel, The Armory Wars, which is a trip. There's a whole chapter essentially where a guy has a conversation with a 10-speed bicycle. And that's a really good song too. 10-speed bicycle is a great song. So I wanted to ask, has your experience being in a metal band, just in a band in general, affected your writing? Has it been more the other way around? Has there been some kind of covalence there between music, writing? Are they relatively partitioned? What's the dichotomy there?
Yeah, I'd say probably the most overlap I get, other than me trying to just intentionally seed Grave of the Waiting with all these references, and like I try to include song titles from every one of our albums in the story. I was going to do like a little competition where like the first person to find so many Easter eggs in the book gets like a free signed copy or something. So now that you know about that, you can definitely win that signed copy.
All right.
Be on the lookout.
You can do the same with mine because I've got a running list of what's in mine right now, and I'm like, this is too much. I have Arrested Development's references there at this point.
Dude, that's so much fun though. Just like filling your story with like these little things that no one else will notice. Like I have a Calvin and Hobbes reference in my book.
Oh.
I don't know if anybody's caught that yet. It seems really obvious to me though. But yeah, in terms of writing and music, so I don't really write many lyrics for our band, and I would love to do a concept album, but we are just sort of lazy and like we barely have time to like even practice these days and record songs. I would say most of how writing has affected music or vice versa is that writing just sort of crowds out my time that I have to spend on writing music. Like I would love to be able to spend more time like putting down these awesome drum tracks and everything. But a lot of times these days, I'm just like taking what the guitarist wrote and I'm like, I can learn that. And it sounds good enough. And then I'll like improvise a little bit later as we get closer to recording. It's definitely a balance. Time is always a struggle.
This is a total detour. I have a friend who's a drummer, and he's tried 2 or 3 times to explain what a drum trigger is, and I still have no idea what the hell he's talking about. Can you explain what a drum trigger is to someone? Assume he has a very low IQ. Just assume that. But Josh, what the hell's a drum trigger?
Okay. I'll try to explain it without relying on my electrical engineering knowledge.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So a drum trigger, basically, when you're playing the drums, right? Especially if you're doing like double bass pedal or you're doing something really fast, one of the big challenges is that you are probably not going to be able to be super consistent with how fast in terms of like the strength of your hits on the drum. So what a drum trigger does is it really just levels out all of that stuff. It'll make it so that every hit is the same consistency. And the way that it does that is you put like a little sensor on your drum that basically detects when there's a vibration. It's called a piezoelectric sensor or piezoelectric if you're of that persuasion. It basically senses a little vibration and then it sends an electrical signal out of it. And the electrical signal will be hooked up to your computer, which normally will be running some suite of software like a DAW, digital audio workstation. And that will be set up to listen for that electrical signal. And when it gets it, it plays a MIDI, like a sample of a kick drum or something. And that'll just be hooked up to the PA. Every time you hit the kick drum, it'll set off this chain of events that results in a pre-recorded sample coming out of the PA and covers it up.
So this is happening in real time. This isn't just in post.
Yeah. Luckily, light is pretty fast. So we can rely on low latency interfaces to just make sure it's all like in time with what you're actually playing live.
I don't think my friend knew what a drum trigger is. His explanation was total bullshit. That made way more sense. Wow. That's pretty interesting.
You could just look at it. It's like, it's magic. I mean, any sufficiently advanced technology that you don't understand, you just treat it like magic and it's fine.
All right. So I was looking at your list of inspirations, and you're a man after my own heart. And I can't wait to talk about this just because there are so many goodies. I've talked about one in particular, even with the previous guest, P.L. Stewart, and a couple others, actually. I think Ryan Cahill as well. But inspiration, what kinds of books, authors, you kind of dabbled in Martin, for example, but what kinds of authors or pivotal events in your life inspired you to write?
Like I mentioned, Song of Ice and Fire was a big inspiration, just getting really obsessed with that. But I would say what really got me into writing was actually Brandon Sanderson. So I was in Florida visiting my grandparents, and we were there for like a week. And I read the entire book, The Way of Kings. That was my intro to Sanderson. And I was really into George R. R. Martin's world building and everything. But now that I've seen like another master at work, I was like, I have to start trying to do this. And luckily, Brandon Sanderson, he puts up like free lectures online. He teaches a creative writing class every year at Brigham Young University, and he posts all the lectures just to YouTube for free. So he's doing a great service to aspiring writers there. And I devoured all those lectures. I took notes on all of them. I treated it as if I was taking the class myself.
That's exactly what I did. That's so cool to hear.
Nice. Yeah, and they're so helpful. They cover so much ground, from like character work to world building, and like I can't list it all here because he just lists, it's everything. He covers everything.
Even the back end of the store too. He talks about getting an agent and what your average percentage might look like if you're trad published versus self.
Yeah.
That was one of the things that really surprised me, because I'd seen, they weren't nearly as detailed, but I'd seen other people talk about writing and craft, world building, but they never talked about how to get a literary agent or anything like that. And he has a whole class devoted to it. And he brings people in from different genres. Here's how you write a novella. Here's how hard sci-fi tends to sound, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah, I love those lectures. So for a long time, I just spent time just absorbing a lot of good advice and doing that more than practicing. But I realized eventually you gotta practice, right? So
Yeah.
even then, like I had a pretty good idea that I wanted to start taking it seriously. Like when I was world building for the story that I was talking about earlier, which has no plan to be published at this point. I realized that I just wanted to really start taking it seriously. I'd been just kind of like doing it a little bit here and there, but then eventually I told my now wife on our first date that I'm writing a book, and I didn't want to be a liar, so I had to I had to keep writing it.
And so you spent the next 3 hours telling her what it's about in the world building.
Yeah, luckily she's a reader too. She's more into like literary classics and everything.
Oh, good.
So I tried not to overwhelm her with too many just nerdy fantasy stories. It was our first date. I had to take it a little bit easy.
Wise.
Yeah, I was like, if I told her I'm writing a book, I really like this girl, so I mean, I got to keep writing this book.
Mhm.
And I'm pretty sure like within the next month, I had already like finished several chapters, and that was for An Ocean of Others. So thank my wife for that story existing.
I think it was Seneca who said, if you want to be a writer, write. And I think the core of what I took away for coming back to Sanderson and, various types of inspiration is they're all, no matter how well intentioned, they all drop the hammer eventually and become real hard asses and saying, well, you just have to write. Like,
Yeah.
I could study basketball and how to be a point guard for 30 years, but that doesn't make me at all qualified when I step on the court. And I would like to talk about this with you. You really do have to get in the game and play. And a lot of that happens with a writers group where a lot of people, hopefully in a charitable sense, tear you a new one.
Yeah.
And tear you a new one with love, if that's not too oxymoronic. But yeah, I think the struggle of writing, though, especially those first steps, can be really, really difficult. Did you mentioned, this kind of lovely incentive, which was you told this lady I'm writing a book and now you got to go write it. What was that like initially? Did you just sit down in front of the laptop and go, I've made a huge mistake?
No, so I'd already been like dabbling with it, and I think we'll talk about the D&D campaign a little bit later, maybe.
Yeah.
But at that point, I was just really in a sort of self-improvement mode. Like I'd been reading a lot of like self-help books. I'd just gotten out of a long-term, long-distance relationship, and so I was like, I just need to, what's the old Reddit advice? Like hit the gym, delete Facebook, lawyer up.
Yeah.
I didn't need a lawyer, but I hit the gym for sure. I was like, all right, well, I'm in this mood where I'm just starting to develop habits and trying to come up with like good ways to live my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, well, I guess I'll add writing in. And I started writing, like, you start with small goals. So I was like a half hour a day, get 100 pages or 100 words out. And that's it. Just like anything's better than nothing. And eventually you do something enough times and you can't stop. And that's where I'm at right now.
Diggity doubts here. Were there any obstacles? Sometimes this is external, more often than not internal, but what kinds of things were keeping you from taking writing seriously? You mentioned even if it was just half an hour, even if it was just 100 words, sitting down and doing it. But while you were sitting down, were there any voices, in not a psychopathic kind of way at least, but schizophrenic, I should say, ways saying, what are you doing, man? Was there any kind of doubt in your mind as you were writing?
I think just because I was in that sort of like self-improvement mindset at the time that I really started taking it seriously, like I'd read some good advice, like don't compare yourself to anybody else. Like I was talking to my friend one time and I told him like, man, I really want to start writing and I've got these ideas, and how am I ever going to be as good as George R. R. Martin? Like this is like right after Game of Thrones season 1 or something.
Yeah.
And he's like, why would you ask that question? Like, like you don't need to be as good as George R. R. Martin. Like if no one did anything unless they were going to be the best in the world at it, like no one would do anything.
That's good. That's good advice, or that's a good point, I should say. Yeah.
Yeah, like one person's the best in the world, but the vast majority, we're like middling. We're amateurs.
Yeah, well, it's there's only one king of the hill or queen of the hill, and I
Exactly.
always thought about it this way because I was terrible about comparison. I probably still am, but was definitely, I can definitely empathize in that. I started to try and visualize it, and I might have heard this somewhere. It might have even been Sanderson, but I just had this visual at this point, which is, your quest. We're thinking about it in D&D terms, 5e, because that's all I know. I don't do the third edition. It sounds ridiculous.
Same.
Yeah, I'm doing 5e. Yeah, I know I'm a pleb for liking 5e, but whatever.
We're both plebs. It's fine. You're in good company.
Yeah. I always visualized it as a mountain or a cliff, if you want to think of it that way. But either way you visualize this thing, it's intensely unrealistic to think that you can, at the base of Mount Everest, jump to the top of it. Like, that doesn't happen physically, conceptually. It just doesn't work. You really do have to just put that first footstep. You just have to plant it at the first inclination there and get to climbing and slogging through it and getting your ass kicked and hitting false peaks. And I've always tried to keep that in mind, because I really do think that a lot of people are convinced they can just jump to the top of the mountain. And I totally understand where that comes from. It tends to be a Western rugged individual mentality, which is that we're kind of full of ourselves at times. And we've been encouraged by a lot of people to be full of ourselves. Like, you should have to some degree, I think a lot of people are under the misconception that you should have an overblown sense of self. And so why wouldn't you try and jump to the top of the mountain? Why would you want to slog through it? But I think more and more, I think we're talking about guys like Malcolm Gladwell, 10,000 hours kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. I think more and more there is a wave of humility drowning a lot of people's narcissism to a certain degree, myself included. I've very openly admitted I'm a narcissist on this podcast. And I think that it is a net positive for society and the literary world as a whole, that I think more writers, especially in the self-pub, this is not to say it isn't in the trad world as well, but I think the self-pub world has really benefited from humility. Did you, when you really got started, you're comparing yourself a lot, were you cognizant of that, or was that something that you just did almost like an autonomic nerve response? You didn't even think about it.
I think I was pretty cognizant of it. And like, after having that discussion with my friend, he said it so succinctly. I'm sure I misquoted him, but he said it in a way, it was just one of those things that like drives itself into your head, and you're like, that is the advice I should follow. Like, that's correct. And also what I'd been reading, I don't even remember what book it was, but one of the many self-help books I read, it was talking about like just only comparing yourself to your past self, because then you're not setting those unrealistic expectations. You're not trying to jump to the top of the mountain. You're just trying to take the next step towards the top. And the very first the first newsletter or blog post that I ever wrote, I love your metaphor, because I had the same idea back in the past. The first blog post, the feature picture was this picture of like a hill receding off into the distance and going up, and there was like stepping stones going up the hill. And I was like, that's what it is to me. It's like one step at a time, but each step you're getting a little bit higher. And you do that for 10 years, and eventually you're going to get to the top of that hill.
Yeah, and that's the way it should be too.
Yeah. And you might not be at the top of Everest, but you'll be at the top of a hill, and you will be better than your past self. And that's all you can really hope to do.
That's a really good point. And yeah, even if it's just a hill, that's still your hill and you conquered it.
Yep.
You've brought up motivational books, and I'm always kind of curious because I was on a real bender for a couple of years. One of my favorites was Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck.
Yeah.
I enjoyed that. Do you recall some of the books you were reading? A couple of the ones that really kicked you between the legs?
So I feel like one of them that I remember right before meeting my wife, that it kind of put me in a really good mind state, was actually Jordan Peterson's book. It was 12 Rules for Life, I think.
Yeah, I have that one. It starts with the crab or the lobster,
the lobster.
Comparison. Yeah, that's what it was. Yeah, I enjoyed that.
He's like such a meme at this point. Like, I feel like he's like a controversial figure now. But this was back in the day when I was just like, I don't know who anybody is. Yeah, that was a really good book. I would definitely recommend reading that. Just trying to maybe not consider who it was written by. And
yeah, well, I would encourage people who are interested in reading Jordan Peterson to understand that as somebody who's more or less agnostic, and he's very overt Christian and looks for the moral undertones in the stories like Jonah and the Whale. that you don't need to be of the faith to absolutely squeeze really good juice out of the fruit he's offering. Did you find yourself picking up books just purely on writing?
A couple, but I feel like mostly my writing advice and like I mostly just got that online. Like my wife got me a master class by Neil Gaiman.
Mhm.
He has a lot of really good advice in there. Masterclass is kind of expensive though, so I would definitely recommend just starting with like all of the free resources out there, like this Sanderson lectures. He has a writing excuses podcast. Those are really great, like bite-sized 15-minute episodes. And then I actually took a self self-publishing class at our local college, and it was just online, and there was only 3 people in the class, so I got a lot of FaceTime with the teacher, and she went above and beyond. Like she was just incredible. Like she actually became my editor for my book,
Oh, cool.
and she'll be doing the this sequel as well. So it was a good way to build a relationship and meet someone who's like a professional.
Okie dokie. Testing the waters. Baby steps. We've dabbled in this, and I'd really like to hear you go deeper, especially because this gets into D&D territory. And don't let me forget, I've got a serious, really important question to ask you about D&D.
Okay.
I'm gonna really, I'm gonna put the spurs to you. We'll see how this goes. So, testing the waters. Tell me about it. What was your initial journey towards becoming a committed writer like?
Well, there was one book that I wrote when I was 10. It's called The Golden Sword. And it was actually probably just one really terrible opening chapter where a kid who is probably just me steps out of his front door already wielding the golden sword.
That was easy.
Just, yeah. Me and my sister used to do all these like just fun, like storytelling things. But all of that has sadly been lost to time with the old family computer. But more seriously, I had an idea for like the science fantasy. That's the thing I was world building before. It was a science fantasy book. The idea was that one character POV would be a fantasy book and the other character's POV would be a sci-fi book, and they're actually like taking place at the same time.
That's
And
really cool.
yeah, I still really want to do that, but it's hard. So I was like, I can't start with this book. This is like a really kind of difficult idea to do. I have to be a really like genre minded when writing that and
Yeah.
very character focused. But I was like, I need practice before I really embark on that journey. So the practice came, the perfect opportunity when we started doing a D&D campaign. And it started off with me just like, I'm a fast typer. So I brought my laptop, or like I had a Bluetooth little keyboard that I would connect to my phone and have the notes app open. And I would just type literally everything that I could about what was happening in the D&D campaign, like what everybody said, every action that happened. I would like label like stats and everything. It was
Wow.
insane. The downside to this, by the way, is that if you're just keeping really good track of everything that's happening, it's really hard to influence it yourself and like find time to like make your own actions and come up with ideas. So my character was like kind of passive in the actual D&D campaign, which is not a great first person like main character in a book. So it started off as just like a very jumbled collection of notes with like inconsistent characters and lots of like inside jokes, and like you know how every D&D campaign is
Oh, yeah.
just kind of crazy in that way. So it took a lot of like disentangling of different plot lines, and like I had to write this thing all the way from the beginning, just not even knowing how it was going to end because we were still in the middle of the campaign. And then I finally get to the end, and I'm like, this is not a book. This is just like a mess of events. And I had to spend a lot of time just like reverse outlining it and like cutting a lot of stuff and trying to add on to what I think was the cool stuff that got or that was done in the event, or sorry, in the campaign, and like trying to make it so that like those moments actually hit.
And would you call yourself an outline? I know to me it's a spectrum. I'm a hybrid. I outline heavily and then discovery right within the outline.
Yeah, I would say that's what I do.
Yeah, and I think that's a good place to be. I think there is this weird binary approach where people say, "Oh, I'm a discovery writer. Oh, I'm an outliner." And I had this conversation, I think it was with Ryan Cahill, where I said, if you're one, you're the other, because a discovery writer, as they're going, is just feeling out things and has a general impression. And I know some people say this, Sam, this doesn't make any sense, but whatever. I'm a contrarian and I'm also an idiot, so we'll see what happens here. But I would argue that a discovery writer who day to day just has a general impression is to a certain extent outlining. And an outliner is absolutely a discovery writer because you have bullet points and then you fill in the blanks with things you're not entirely sure are even going to happen, unless you're an absolute purist, in which case that sounds hellish. I would not want to write that way.
No.
So I really do think that like there's definitely Venn diagramming happening there, one more so than the other. I think discovery writers are less of an outliner, but I definitely think outliners tend to be more discovery writers than they're either aware of or would like to admit. What I wanted to revisit too with your D&D campaign is when I was first starting out, I had an amazing DM. He was really awesome, and he knew I was a writer. His wife is in a writing group I was running. And I just approached him one time and I said, would it be cool if I wrote an antagonist? I won't tell you when to insert them into the campaign. I won't tell you what to do, other than I'm going to write a backstory for them. And I'm going to give you a general idea. They're a tiefling. They were corrupted by Nox. It's going to be this, this, this. He can kind of suck the life out of anything, even paintings. Like he looks at a painting and sucks the life out of it. So it becomes very dull and drab and stuff like that. And his jaw like hyperextended. He would just inhale everything. It was really, it was, yeah, it was kind of creepy, but it was like nothing groundbreaking. So I gave him that. He really enjoyed it, and actually became a novella I wrote. It's called The Burning Man, which probably is a title I can't use because somebody else has done it, or it's written about Burning Man. Yeah. I don't know. It's just an LSD trip. It sounds like Hunter S. Thompson probably wrote it, yeah. But I wrote it, and then I really enjoyed the anticipation because I was playing an Inquisitor Paladin, an Inquisitor in the sense of the role playing. He was I believe he was Oath of Vengeance, because that's the best if you're not going Oathbreaker, if you ask me. And then Oathbreaker's so OP. I know we're doing inside baseball. I don't fucking care. But it was so much fun waiting for the drop.
Yeah.
When it finally happened, we were in a clearing and this guy just shows up. And all of a sudden we start to feel kind of drained. And then it was this whole epic battle. And I realized what was happening. I was like, we have to run. We're not ready for this. We have to run. And everyone wanted to keep fighting. And it was like, I had to roll for persuasion to get everybody to leave. It was a lot of fun. And we ended up having an epic campaign. My DM, shout out to Eric, absolute just genius behind the board. That, I know, is a really roundabout way of asking. Obviously, your D&D campaign made it into your writing, and I want to look at that a little bit more. But did your writing make it into the D&D campaigns?
Yeah, it definitely did. So when I started writing, we were probably like halfway through the campaign, I would say. And when I say halfway through the campaign, I mean halfway through like the first arc of what was planned to be like a 7-arc campaign or something. Like every island nation in the thing had its own story that our DM planned. We never did anything past like a few sessions in arc 2. They always get canceled, don't they? But the the end of the first arc of this campaign is really where the first book ends. And I had kind of caught up in my writing because we were pretty slow with how often we would schedule these campaigns, these sessions. So I'd actually gotten to the point where like I was caught up in my first draft to like what was going to happen next, and I had to wait until the next session to like figure out what was happening. And I sort of had an idea for where I wanted to take my main character at the time. He was starting to more solidify, and he was very passive throughout the earlier sections, but I was like, I want him to like actually do something at the end of the book, something that I can then like revise and like build up to. And so I remember, I think I was watching like Critical Role or something, and for some reason one of the guy's shirts just really stuck out to me. It was just like, bad choices make good stories. And I was like, I'm going to make a bad choice right now. And so that bad choice is how the book ends. I won't spoil what it is, but it definitely influenced the campaign and may have like ruined the DM's plans for what was going to happen next.
This is what good players do. Yeah, we go murder hobo. Your first run you never played, so you murder hobo, and
yep.
The DM's just like, oh, thanks. That was 80 hours of work.
Yeah, down the drain.
Yeah. So when you're talking about the novel itself, and I definitely saw it once I saw the ensemble coming together, I'm like, oh, there's the ranger, there's the fighter,
Yep.
there's your paladin, the bard, and then essentially like what's the race? Warforged,
Hmm.
your iteration of the dwarves, which I thought was really cool. Scar dwarves. I was like, oh, that sounds awesome. And I was like, oh, this is great. It's a D&D quest, and I was all for it. I had a lot of fun, and you know what to expect to a certain degree, and especially if you play D&D, you know what to expect from their skill set, and seeing how people utilize that is always interesting because everybody seems to have a different iteration
Mm-hmm.
of what their barbarian looks like, for example, especially when it comes to the role playing thing. A lot of people like to play against tropes, and I tend to do that too, just because I'm a contrarian. So, when you were writing the book, though, how much did you make a conscious decision not to base the story entirely off of your campaign, or did you just feel like it was strong enough that you wanted to show more or less one to one what happened in this campaign?
Yeah, that was a really hard part of the second draft. I think it was either the second or the third draft that I had to make the decision basically to like really dial back like really D&D specific elements. Like at first, like there's a character Lorelei, she's like the bard, and she like fought one of the monsters and used like vicious mockery. I wrote that into the book as her just basically coming up with all these curses and everything, and sort of like trying to be poetic, and like she had like magic music and everything, and it was like very heavily inspired by the D&D like magic system. But I really wanted to like take a step back and do my own world building. So I had to try and find like ways to translate all of the D&D elements into sort of my own world without it being like too copy paste. I was really worried at the time about like copyright and stuff. I was like, am I even allowed to mention like these spell names?
I was gonna ask about that too. I don't know what the legality is with like Wizards of the Coast and all that stuff too. Yeah.
Yeah, so I didn't want to take a risk or anything. So like it's my first book. I might as well just like go all out and come up with my own stuff anyway. I'm mostly doing this for the practice. It was
Mm-hmm.
supposed to be a practice book.
Well, I want to get to that, and sorry if I'm derailing you here, but I
Yeah.
really want to get to that, which is I feel the exact same way in your notes. You said more or less that the first book is the practice book, and I think most everybody who writes can agree that it is a brutal, awesome learning experience. I usually describe it to people when they ask about what it's like writing your first book, which is it's you teaching and attending the shittiest master class out there. And I want to know, maybe that's definitely been my experience, but for you, what was it like? Uh, what was the learning curve like? What was the experience like?
For writing the first book,
Yeah.
it was hard. The very first chapter I wrote, oh my god, it's painful to read. It's so bad. Like I have the whole first draft up in Google Docs still. Or no, it just might be like PDFs in Google Drive. Part of me almost wants to like release those as like like for just for anybody who's like a paying like Patreon tier person, so that I know you're not just gonna like roast me. um,
I
because they're terrible.
I just put out a chapter sample from my fourth draft, and it's on my Patreon. And I was just sitting there thinking, like, this is gonna suck. This is gonna go so bad. Coming back to you though, sorry, I'm just kind of curious because we have a lot of parallels here, and I'm really enjoying exploring them. Did you? Because you mention in the acknowledgement section of your novel how influential and beneficial the writers group was.
Mhm.
Were you in a writers group during that time period? Were you getting more or less real time feedback on that first draft?
Sort of, yeah. So the way it happened was, I told you I had to start writing for serious after I told my wife on our date. That was in September. And then that year I was like, okay, I'm going to join NaNoWriMo. It seems to be a big thing and everybody likes doing it. And, I need an excuse to write anyway. So I joined my local NaNoWriMo community, Montco Rimo, from Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. And there was a ton of great people there. I just like participated in Discord and would like try and go to all like the ride alongs and just really try and like get engaged with the community. And I guess at some point, maybe 3 or 4 months later, I just got a DM from someone who was in that group. We're going to make a writing group, and it's just going to be people from the Montco Rimo. And like, none of us have really done this before. So we all seem like sort of taking it seriously. So maybe it'll work out. And I'm still with that writing group today. So it definitely worked out.
So is that entirely SFF? science fiction fantasy?
Yes ish. So one of the writers was mostly writing romance.
Was it dry or wet romance?
It was medium romance.
Moist
Yeah.
romance?
Oh, don't put it like that.
Yeah, I've done. I was in a writers group before the one I started, and a lady. She was actually a very talented writer, but she wrote drenched
Oh man,
romance.
that's not my thing.
And I would go through her work and critique it at a cafe or something, and I couldn't stop making faces to the point where I had to just walk out of the place. Yeah, just grab
Yeah.
my coffee and go. And I'm like, I can't do this in public. I can't.
No, we got to do this back at home.
Yeah. So, I mean, because I benefited from that though, because she told me a lot about conventions in romance. I don't think it's pejorative or anything like that, demeaning to say that romance has a really strict regimen for how you write it. And that seems to be the case. I've talked to a lot of romance writers who repeat that. So I don't think I'm dragging the genre through the mud here. And it seems like it's quite profitable too. Romance is the best selling, most lucrative of the genres,
Yeah,
aside from like YA, but the disparity between the two in terms of profit margins is considerable still. Were you benefiting from other genres? Because I did initially find myself, I was reading a memoir. Like one lady, she was terminally ill. And so she's writing a memoir. And I really found that, it was very touching. And it was also very enlightening to see how somebody portrays themselves in, their twilight hours. Did you find yourself periodically encountering other genres that seeped into your own writing or just kind of gave you food for thought?
absolutely. I have like three things I want to say here. I'm going to try and remember to say them all.
I'll hold you to account here.
I'm going to probably ramble on the first one and then we'll forget and move on.
Welcome to my podcast.
But like when you were saying how romance is very like trope heavy, I totally agree with that. And I think it reminds me of what you were saying before when you wrote the D&D antagonist and you were waiting for the drop, like when is he going to show up? There's like that anticipation. And it's like if you know the tropes that you're going to get when you pick up a book, it's like that same kind of thing. Like you like this and you're like waiting to see how it pans out this time. It's like when you're listening to a heavy metal song or like a deathcore song and when all the instruments drop out near the end and there's like the build up, they're going to do some like a really silly breakdown and it's going to be
Yeah.
freaking awesome and make your face twist up.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why we want to listen to the songs. We know what we're getting. Yeah, there's definitely nothing wrong with like tropes or anything like that. And I would even say for me, and this is definitely a personal preference, that I spoil myself on the books. Like I will just like read ahead, read the spoiler reviews of a book because I get more out of it when I know like these plot twists are coming. And as an author, I can sort of see how they're building that and how they're incorporating that. And like, then I can just appreciate it more.
You're the first person I've ever heard say that. That makes total sense though.
Yeah, everybody hates spoilers, and I totally get it. Am I allowed to spoil Game of Thrones season 1 at this point? Like, it's been enough time,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. If you don't know what happens to
over 10
Ned,
years.
then that's on you.
That is still the hardest I've ever been hit by anything in a story. Like, seeing him die at season 1, I felt like I got punched in the chest,
Yeah.
literally. Like, I felt physical pain. That made me want to read the books. And knowing that came made me just, first of all, appreciate my time with Ned Stark on the pages so much more because I know this is all I'm getting. And second, I saw like how we were building up to that. I like everything made more sense. Like it was all just laid out perfectly. That's when I decided I'm like, I don't care about spoilers. I just want to know what's going to happen. And then if a good story is enhanced by spoilers, in my opinion. But I know everybody hates spoilers, so I don't spoil anything. I think that was maybe one and a half of the things I wanted to say.
Okay. I'm down with it. I like this.
Can you remind me of what the question actually was?
Oh, shit.
Oh, actually, no, I remember. It was you're asking, have I benefited from like reading other romance or like different genres in my writing group?
Oh, that's right.
And I definitely have. So like the one author who was writing romance, her name is Liz Laby, and her first book is actually published now. It's called Love Again, and it is about like a woman who has lost the ability to paint because she's gone through heartbreak, and it's about her like meeting a new person, falling in love with them, and like regaining her inspiration and her ability to paint. It's incredible. It's an amazing book. It was a 5-star read for me, and not just because she was my friend. It was really, really good. I'd recommend checking it out. But talking with Liz and the other authors about different romance tropes and different genres that they're writing has 100% improved my own writing, improved my ability to like critique story beats and everything like that. And I've even got like some romance elements in book 2 of the Sibling Sons. I'm romance is, like we said, very trope heavy, and I'm not someone who really thinks in terms of tropes most of the time. So I would hesitate to call it a romance arc because it doesn't really have the tropes, or it probably does, and I just have accidentally used them in some stupid way. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say.
Setback time here, Josh. What kinds of setbacks presented themselves on your journey? I mean, it sounds pretty pie in the sky so far. Obviously, you've gone through a lot of the trials and tribulations of the postmodern writer, but was there more below the surface things that were really holding you back from getting deeper into writing?
Yeah, so I feel like for a while it was, like you said, it was pretty rosy. I just enjoyed doing it. I had plenty of time. These days, time is definitely the issue. Like that's the setback at this point, is just it's always time, and you just never have enough of it. And making the time to write is very important, otherwise it won't happen. And you've got to balance it with everything else you've got going on. So I've got an energetic new puppy who made me late for this podcast recording this morning. A work schedule that is more and more like requiring me to commute into the city. I've got my wife and family and everything, and it's always just difficult. But you know, that's like something that's inevitable for every writer. Like you're always going to have to find time to fit things in, and life is always going to find a way to get in the way. And sometimes you just have to let it. Yeah, all you can really do is just prioritize, figure out what's important to you, and you can always come back to a story later. But one other setback that I guess is more personal to me, because time is something everybody has to deal with. This year, I noticed that I'd kind of been pushing myself too hard, and I started. So I'm not someone who like feels things very strongly, I would say,
Mm-hmm.
most of the time. Brandon Sanderson actually talks about this same kind of thing, how he is always at like a 70% of happiness, and he just kind of like barely fluctuates. It's hard to move the needle.
Mm-hmm.
That really resonates with me. I feel like I'm also always at 70% happiness, but I noticed that I was experiencing like symptoms of depression. Like I just made it really hard to get up in the morning. I was not happy with my job, and just like how I was spending a lot of the days. It was hard to get into the mindset to write, especially because I'd sort of burned myself out, and you have a deadline that's approaching and you're just like watching it come, and you're just sitting there like, oh, I should do something. And you don't. And then that just makes you feel worse. And I still don't really know exactly how to talk about this or how to quote unquote fix it or anything, because like depression,
There's no need to fix it.
yeah, it's just something to like live with and manage.
Yeah, it is what it is. Yeah.
It manifests differently in everybody, and for me, I'm working on it. I'm trying to grapple with it.
Mm-hmm.
Telling myself to enroll in therapy for months now, but just keep putting it off. And you know, it's definitely not a good long-term plan. Yeah, not the healthiest way to deal with my mental health, but I'm like so close to a deadline right now that my brain is just like in go mode. It's just like finish and then deal with everything after. There will be time.
That maybe I can serve as a cautionary tale. I don't want to derail your schedule, but
No, please.
it might actually serve you in the long term. That's my hope here. So story time, which is I'm bipolar type 2. And I'd like to clarify for people who've watched too many movies, which is bipolar isn't just toggling between depression and what's called mania, which is exemplified by hypersexual activity, impulsive spending, lack of sleep, hyper energy, too many tasks you can't really effectively complete. It's not just toggling between those two over the course of a day. What happens, and this is kind of baton pass into what I was going to say, which is when I first started my writers group in 2017, I was nowhere near as grounded and organized as I am. And without structure, and I was working a full-time job, I'm a special ed teacher. So I was doing that 40 hours, or like 55. I'm a teacher. I'm not, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I would do the sped thing all day and come home and I would write for 3 to 4 hours a night. And some of that was critiquing other people's writing too, which was fine. It was all of this is a learning experience at numerous strata. But I did that for a couple of years. And it took me a long time to realize that I was in a manic sprint, is kind of how I describe it. And really what broke it was, and I've always wrestled with depression and suicidal ideation. I have some good conversations with a good friend of mine, Daniel Lyon, and his podcast, Psychedelic Stories, talking about this sort of stuff. Anybody interested in just hearing really transformative experiences about various people, even one of my previous guests, Robert Stark, listened to Daniel's podcast, Psychedelic Stories. Shameless plug, but he's my friend. I don't give a shit. Yeah, it's my podcast. So what happened is in about 2020, really like a month or two prior to COVID, I started going to an mobility and orientation program for visually impaired people. I have a degenerative eye condition. Like I haven't driven a car since 2019. It's just not safe. And so I started doing this program. It was very stressful. I'm coming to grips with the disability, all kinds of stuff. And I did that for a few months. And then one day I just couldn't do anything. I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't eat. I was sleeping 12 to 16 hours a day or just laying in bed for a lot of that. I remember one time a friend came over to do a podcast I used to do with him, and it was about 6-ish in the evening, and I was still in my underwear, just like fried. I looked like a bomb went off in my face, you know. So I ended up having to go to an intensive outpatient program 5 days a week, which is really difficult because of course this happens. One of the people in this group therapy session I had to attend more or less had to, or else the cops would come knock on my door and do what's called a wellness check, air quotes. One of the guys in this group was totally blind. He'd had a hunting accident. He never went into it and was entirely blind. I have what's called low vision. I can see well enough to function, but I'm not blind, whereas he was entirely blind. And so I had to do that for about 4-ish months. It was brutal. It was brutal. I came home crying all the time. I would just be in tears. I could barely talk. But gradually I got out of there and I started going to therapy. I'm saying that really hard, so maybe it'll stick, but everybody has their own pace, and I totally understand that. It took me decades to realize that I had serious stuff going on, so I do sympathize. And if you're more in the Sanderson kind of level, he's talked about that a lot too. And Dan Wells, him and their podcast, Intentionally Blank, the latest one with Dan, he just talked entirely about depression. It was actually very candid and genuine. I found it actually uplifting in a way. So I finally got out of this intensive outpatient program. But what had happened is when I'd had that essentially mental breakdown, that's how I describe it, that mental breakdown a little ways into that visual orientation program, I didn't write for a year. I did the orientation program, had a breakdown, stopped writing, did the intensive outpatient program for months, finished another 4 months, 5 months of the visual orientation program once I came back to that. And I lost like a year and change of writing. I just didn't do it because I had no gas in the tank. It was always gnawing away at me because I was raised Irish Catholic, and I've talked about this on the pod before, which is just that guilt and shame make me write. And I'm okay with that because it's gotten me where I am. So I'm good with it. It's not healthy. Wisdom is following your own advice, and I'm not a wise person. So kind of getting back to you, because this podcast is about you. I can't believe I've talked this long.
No, thanks for sharing all that.
Appreciate it. Anyway, in regards to depression and therapy and like that, all that stuff, it really is at your own pace. And I think sometimes you really do you just have to have your ass kicked.
Yeah.
There's a saying in a lot of support groups, especially AA, which is you can't fall off the floor, and you just kind of have to bottom out. I'm hoping that's not the case for you. I would never wish that on anybody. A lot of alcoholics, though, that tends to be what happens. I don't know entirely what I'm trying to say, other than I would just be aware, and this is kind of going out to everybody, if you suspect something like that is happening, to address it relatively soon, because I didn't, and I was a good 3/4 of the way through the novel that I was working on at the time. And then I just didn't write for a year because I delayed. I didn't attend to my mental and emotional health. I ended up actually taking an immense amount of time off from the thing that was giving me purpose. And so it kicked my ass numerous times. And so I would just say to certain people that you might actually want to attend to this thing, because if you do want to keep writing, it will serve you in the long run to be more cognizant and mindful of those. And I think stuff like meditation, I was looking at your preface and maybe we're jumping ahead here, but who cares? It's our pod. Now it's our pod. Yeah, I just passed ownership onto you too.
Oh, wow. I get some of the profits, right?
Yeah. You'll also be, when I finally get canceled, you'll also be dragged into the mud with me.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, no, just kidding.
It'll be for this episode. It'll be fine.
Yeah, it'll be all things I say. You're doing great. Yeah, do you find, and maybe this is something you're still just kind of exploring, and if it's a 70% but with undertones of depression, I don't know what that's like, because I usually, when I hit the floor, I hit it pretty hard. Have you found things like meditation have been helpful? For me, writing really does help when I'm having those kinds of days or sometimes weeks. Do you find like writing actually serves as a kind of antidepressant?
For sure. So I'll do meditation first and then writing and other things. So yeah, like meditation absolutely made a big difference. Like if I didn't meditate for like a good amount of time back in, I don't know, 2016, 2017, like I had established a practice, would do it like most days of the week. And just really following like Sam Harris and his Waking Up app.
It's great. It's absolutely transformative.
Yeah. And it's not something that I still keep up with, but I feel like it implanted like a mindset into my head. It gave me a skill where like at any time I'm able to just like step back and just observe what I'm feeling and these thoughts. And it's definitely not like an instinctual thing. Like I'm not always in this like Zen place. But I find that it's easier to access nowadays. And so, I mean, if I didn't have that, I don't know that I ever even would have noticed that I was depressed. I think things could have just like kept spiraling down without me really picking up on the fact that like, all right, these are the thoughts that are going through my head. And like, I need to do something to address this because this is not normal. So that meditation definitely helps, first of all, in sort of like diagnosing. Like I would not say I'm self-diagnosed. I'm like so bad at like all of the maintenance things in life, like oil changes and stuff. I'm always like very focused on like I'm just go go go, which is not good. You should definitely change your car's oil. I always wait very long to do this, but it's the same thing for like making doctor's appointments, enrolling in therapy, all those types of things. I'm rambling. I forget where I was going with this.
No, you're good. I just rambled. You can ramble if you want.
Let's switch to writing. Definitely is in some way an antidepressant. Like I notice that if I go for a long stretch, like when I was burnt out after NaNoWriMo and like December, I don't think I wrote a single word in December last year.
And I not to interrupt, but I'm gonna. So I honestly I don't agree with NaNoWriMo because I think it has the same effect that a New Year's
resolution.
New Year's resolution is I'm going to lose 20 pounds and I'm going to start hitting the gym. And you go hardcore instead of getting a walking start and have that whiplash effect. It's like stretching a rubber band as much as you can. When it snaps, it hurts.
Mm-hmm.
And I think NaNoWriMo is actually detrimental to certain writers. I think a small percentage benefit from it. But me personally, I've been pretty vocal with friends when they ask if I'm going to do it and saying that I actually think NaNoWriMo does not serve writers. I think for some people, again, a small percentage benefit and they get a whole novel out and it gets them started in writing. But I think it sets a very unhealthy expectation in that for people who aren't aware, NaNoWriMo is where you write a whole novel in the month of November. And for people who aren't used to writing too, don't realize that writing a novel takes years sometimes. Like it takes years and tons of commitment. And to suddenly plunge headfirst into those waters without really knowing how to swim can be dangerous in a sense. So I don't want to detract, but I think there's a PSA that I personally have been meaning to throw out there. But going to NaNoWriMo, you lost a month afterward. Please continue. I'm sorry I keep interrupting you.
No. It's your podcast.
It's my podcast. That's right.
You could interrupt. You don't even have to let me talk. You just mute me at this point.
That's right. I could do that. Yeah. I'm the DM of this podcast. Oh my God.
Yeah. You got to get us canceled by the end. So
don't worry. It'll happen. Yeah. Don't worry. I'll start getting back to Jordan Peterson or something.
Yes. Perfect. Let's go over all of his tweets.
Oh my God.
So yeah, NaNoWriMo, I do agree. Like it can definitely be unhealthy to try and like force yourself to sit there and write 2,000 words every day. Sometimes those words just aren't ready to come out. Like,
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
I try to use Nano a little bit differently. Like, I never actually aim to get 50,000 words. I just try and do as much as I can in the month. But I think I still do push myself a little too hard. Yeah, that month of December, that is sort of when I realized that not only was I burnt out, but maybe because of the burnout and not writing, and also like not being able to give 100% of my attention to work and everything. And like, I feel like just the doldrums of winter, and I didn't get to see like many friends that month. It all just sort of compounded, and I was like, that's when I sort of noticed that something was wrong. And when I started writing again in January, it really like uplifted me. I got like 25,000 words done in January.
Nice.
It was a really solid month. And then I was like, all right, we're back. We're back, baby. Another month. February goes by. I get like 15,000 words. Then March, and I'm like, oh, I'm tired. I didn't have anything left. I like spent all the gas. And then April, I was like getting ready for my honeymoon, and I didn't get any writing done in April either. And then this book is supposed to be done in June. I'm like, it's now May, and I still have like 60% of the book to write. Luckily, I'm in a better place right now. I think I'm still a bit in crunch mode, but it's been feeling good. And I think one of the actual other antidepressants in my life has been getting a puppy. That's not a solution I would recommend to everybody. But I think what really helps me is just like having responsibility and like a schedule and meaning and everything, and taking care of this puppy. I mean, that he keeps you on your toes, but he also makes it so you have a schedule and you're like being really mindful about how you're spending your time, because like he's only going to be in the crate taking a nap for an hour. So I better do something useful with that hour before I have to take him out and play with him again and tire him out and feed him and train him. Yeah, for me at least, just being mindful about time boxing and making sure that I'm meeting my commitments and my responsibilities, it all starts to like snowball. And like then I'd start noticing like, oh, I'm better at making time for writing. Oh, I'm better at like getting stuff done for work. Oh, I'm more likely to reach out to my friends and say hi and collaborate with other authors. And I don't know. I feel like I go through like ups and downs around that 70%. On a good day, I'm at like 80.
Going pro, and with my previous guest, PL Stewart, I think it's time to rewrite this draft of this section, which is, when did you realize you'd gone pro? But in parentheticals there, pro according to you, because I used to contextualize this as full time, and I don't think that's appropriate anymore. I think whatever your pro is, because you and I both work full time jobs, but I think you and I also consider ourselves professional writers. We take it serious, we're consistent about it. So for you, Josh, when did you realize you'd gone your pro? Was there an aha moment to it? Was it organic? Did you write the end, even though it wasn't the last book in the series, and that first book, and go, here we go? What was going pro like for you?
So yeah, I think even by my own definition, I would not say that I've gone pro. I still feel very much like an amateur, but I feel like amateur has connotations that I don't generally associate with it.
Sorry, yeah, like, why do you think that? What's going on there? Why do you think you're amateur? Because you're published, you take writing seriously. By most metric, I'd say you're, if you don't want to consider yourself professional, maybe semi-professional. So why do you think you're an amateur?
Yeah, I think this is probably just like semantics in some way. Like maybe semi-professional is a good way to put it, because I do spend a lot of time working on the craft, and I put a lot of money into it, and I definitely do take it seriously. But I call myself an amateur sort of to make sure that I don't lose focus on what I'm supposed to be doing. So that blog post I mentioned with the stepping stones to the top of the hill, that first blog post was called "I Don't Know What I'm Doing." And it was back when I was like floundering for content ideas. The article was sort of like tongue in cheek, the title, but really it was me embracing the fact that I am an amateur. I have no experience under my belt. And at this point, I do have some experience under my belt, but the point is that I wanted to make sure that I'm always willing to like humble myself, make sure that I'm always open to learning, that I never think like, oh, I'm better than this author or whatever who's just starting out. And the key part to me of being an amateur is that you have to be willing to make mistakes in public. Like, to me, that is really the only path that I feel is worthwhile, because making those mistakes in public, not only is that a public service to everybody else who can then avoid those mistakes, um, but like you said, getting honest critique and honest feedback is really important for judging where you are. Like, going back to the picture again, like, which stepstone am I on? I don't really know unless I put it all out there and kind of like gauge people's reaction. And so to me, it feels like that's the only path, because it feels like there's probably a lot of authors who we would definitely consider pro, who we may be under the illusion that like they have it all figured out. They know what they're doing. And to some extent they do, because they have a lot of experience. They've been doing this a long time. But really, I think they're all still just like charting their own course and trying to like make decisions in the day and in the here and now, and probably just started out as lost and confused as all of us do. So I think there really are just as many roads to success as there are successful authors, and you can't just replicate what someone else is doing. So I've chosen to just call myself an amateur and embrace that until my definition of pro for myself would be that I can quit my full-time job and fully just focus on this. Until then, I have to consider this simultaneously like a hobby, a business, a career. It's like Schrodinger's authorship or something.
So, talked about definitions of amateur, pro, where you started, D&D, and I just remembered I didn't ask you the D&D question.
Oh, I forgot to remind you, so this is my fault.
You're all right. It's your podcast. It's your mistake. Don't worry. I just keep passing this buck around. So, I don't want to hear they all have their pros and cons. I ask you this question, sir.
Oh, no. I know exactly what question it is already.
You can only pick one class. We're not talking about multi-classing, though if you want to go into that afterward, we can. You only get to choose one class in D&D 5e. Which is it and why?
So I'm trying to think of like the optimal thing here, because sadly the truth is that they do all have their pros and cons, but I'm not allowed to say that.
So thinking of it more from a role-playing aspect, maybe than in terms of pure stats for OP, min-maxing and all that, is there one that you think you would, regardless of skill set, have the most fun playing consistently?
I mean, I feel like I'm a real basic guy, so I would probably just get big sword and smash things. I feel like that's always pretty satisfying, and then I don't have to think too hard about it.
So is that barbarian? Because that could double as paladin or fighter for that matter.
Yeah, I feel like maybe paladin would be a good one for me. So I like the heavy armor, so that I don't have to worry about getting hurt too bad. Get the big sword, got some magic to help me out, some utility. I would say, yeah, definitely. And I'm gonna reveal my ignorance here by saying I don't really know what an Oathbreaker Paladin is, even though my character is an Oathbreaker Paladin.
It's
yeah, one of the guys in the campaign played that, but I don't think he like really used it that much. So I'm like, it's part of his backstory and the lore, but I don't know what the skills associated with it are.
It more or less is what it sounds like. You take like the Oath of the Ancients or Vengeance, and then they have very strict tenets, and if you break them, you're an Oathbreaker, in which case sometimes, usually what they do, like I'm playing Baldur's Gate 3, which for everybody curious, is it up to the hype? Absolutely, and then some go buy Baldur's Gate 3. I rarely buy games full price. It's phenomenal. Anyway, Oathbreaker breaks their oath, and they're usually approached by Death Knights or like other Oathbreakers and say, hey, if you take this oath, now you're an Oathbreaker, and there's a whole new skill set that opens up that most people would argue, whether it's standard or the homebrew versions, is way, way too powerful. And you can still lay hands and have like a 60 hit point pool. It's ridiculous. What I want to get to also is more important is that was actually a test. There was only one right answer, and you answered it correctly. So I want to applaud you for that. I appreciate that.
I feel like I was led to that answer.
No, you might have been. Yeah, there was a little bit of Not so subtle cueing going on there.
Is that Darren Brown mind games going on
here? I was doing some mind flaying. What can I say? You know what? I think I agree with you. I think that the paladin actually is, because there is the obvious aspect of, like you said, you can tank, do magic, and to a certain extent deal real damage.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that the paladin has, I think you and I are, and I know I've read your work, so I have a somewhat of an idea here. I think the paladin, because of their rigid nature, this constant tightrope you're walking of, this is my oath, I can't break it. But then you and I have different sensibilities from what our characters might have. That's half the fun, is playing against yourself. And I think that the paladin is one that, because it almost has like a template that comes with your character in terms of how you can role play them to a certain degree, that you can actually have a lot of fun with it.
Yeah.
Having said that, though, I mean, there is nothing quite as fun as playing a wizard, because especially if you do wild magic, then it's just raw absurdity.
Oh, yeah.
And I've seen it in action, and watching my buddy accidentally heal our enemies again and again has been pretty damn funny.
Yeah, the last campaign I was playing in, we had a pixie with wild magic, and that character was insane.
Anyway, back to my question. Man, you can really tell when I haven't gotten enough sleep. I was up riding kind of late, and oh yeah, yeah. I guess I'm in good company. I was playing Baldur's Gate all last night. I'm not gonna apologize. I spent more time in the character creation than I did playing the game, but that's the kind of person I am. Back to you. It's your podcast and my podcast, The New World. How are you different today? You've had all these experiences. You're continuing to, whether you think you're an amateur, semi-pro, we talk about metrics and definition of professional writers. And I believe you started in 2015 writing seriously. Is that correct?
No, I think it was a little later. It was like 2018. Fairly new still. It's been 5 years almost. When did that happen?
So relatively new to this thing, and I didn't really take it seriously until about 2017. So I'm with you. How are you different today? It sounds like you're still going through certain things, understanding your own mind, and it sounds like mindful ways that are healthy. But how are you different today compared to when you first started out writing?
I think the biggest difference is now I feel like I'm much more just engaged with the community. I mostly stick to Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I don't know what to call it anymore.
I know. I always have to like put Twitter/X or something.
Yeah.
Like, whatever. But anyway, yeah, I feel like that's mostly where my online presence is. And I like just kind of like signal boosting other authors that I see doing cool things, and like celebrating their wins and doing collaborations and giveaways and sales and stuff with them. I feel like that's probably the biggest difference from when I started. It was very much like a solitary undertaking at first, but it's much easier if you collaborate with other authors and team up and find people who are in the same place as they're in their writing career as you are. It's also way more fun being able to just like celebrate everybody's wins rather than just your own. That's worthwhile, and I feel like that gives you like a sunnier outlook on life too. Plus, everybody's gonna appreciate it. Like if you're signal boosting,
a rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah, exactly. So there's that, and I think that's a big one. I guess internally, I feel like nowadays I feel like I just like understand my priorities better now. Like my wife and family, like they have to be number one. And like anytime there's a conflict between like I want to write versus like I got to take the dog out, or my wife has got a headache and I need to like help her out, I don't even think about those things anymore. It's just like we go right. No, I'm just kidding.
There's only one right answer to that.
Yeah. So yeah, there's that, and like we talked about the depression and the burnout, and I think recently I made a pretty big shift where I'd always heard the advice that like if you want to be a professional writer, you need to be putting out a book every year. And I think to some degree that's sort of true, because like the market will reward you if you do that
within the self-pub realm, definitely.
Yeah, especially in self-pub.
Yeah.
But for me, like I tried that. I was supposed to put this book out this year. Like I was really trying so hard to do that, and I kept saying every newsletter, I'm like, I know it's getting tight still, but I think we can pull it off. I think you'll be the first ones to know if we can't. And they recently found out that they're not getting the book this year. Um, so I figured I needed to just be more realistic. Like, if I was getting burnt out and that was happening like pretty consistently, like every other month or every 2 or 3 months,
Hmm.
like I can't just keep up that pace. I need to just slow it down, give myself time to breathe, time to think. I still love writing, so I'm still writing as much as I can, especially when there's a deadline approaching. I have to turn the book into my editor, and I'm on her schedule. But like I'll be publishing as fast as I can. But if I can't publish every year, I know I just have to like forgive myself and just be okay with that.
What are your thoughts on that? Because I've had conversations with a lot of self-pub authors, guys like Ryan again, who talk about the importance of that. And I'm not saying Ryan's, on the mountaintop with two clay tablets saying we all have to do that. It's just what works for him, and in terms of his productivity, he can pull it off. What are your thoughts on that, though? Because I think this is similar to the NaNoWriMo thing. And you have just described how this had an aspect of burnout to it. I imagine it was stressful because you're looking at the calendar, you know what's coming.
Yeah.
And deep down, I suspect you, like a lot of us, knew that it wasn't going to happen, but you keep pushing yourself to the point of detriment.
Mm-hmm.
So, what are your thoughts on this whole idea in self pub? Because I've been trying to take a census with various guests on self pub when it comes up. What are your thoughts on the idea that it's strongly encouraged in self pub to publish one book per year, if not bang out on top of it a short story novella?
I mean, I think it's partly really strongly encouraged because it's sort of just true. Like, there seems to be a lot of data backing it up.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that, like, if you are putting out a book a year, and maybe this is something like you push yourself and you put out a trilogy, and then you give yourself a little more time before the next trilogy or something. Yeah, I mean, like, readers will reward you for that. Like, everybody likes knowing that they're going to be getting another book soon. It makes them more likely to try the first one if they know the second one's coming out without too long of a wait. And I feel like to some extent, like George R. R. Martin and Patrick Rothfuss are hurting us in this regard.
This is exactly what I talked with PL about.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He called it the Martin Rothfuss effect.
Oh, man. All right. So we're on the same wavelength.
But yeah, I think you'd really enjoy talking to PL. It was really enlightening. He had some really salient points about that topic, but also a lot of it going into the idea of how the fan base, and sometimes, and I said this in the last pod, it's almost used in a derogatory sense, but the fan base, air quotes, is constantly clamoring for the next book and adding stress to the writer in a sense that for guys like Rothfuss, though I don't think this affects Martin. He seems like a grousy old man who doesn't give a damn. But I think guys like Rothfuss, and I understand there's some other financial stuff that is also kind of complicated things, but his mental health clearly has suffered as a result of reader anticipation. But yeah, getting back to what you're saying, I do think that the self-pub book a year thing really has also trickled into, if we're talking about guys like Martin or Rothfuss, it has trickled into trad publishing as well. Do you see that, or is that just me projecting?
No, I think that's right. Just thinking about Rothfuss and mental health and everything, and George R. R. Martin, like, I feel like fame is a terrible thing. It can be.
One of the best parts about being a writer is you can be pretty well known. I don't know what Robin Hobb looks like. No. I don't know. I mean, there are a ton of writers I love. Dan Simmons is an amazing sci-fi writer. I have no idea. I would walk right past him. He'd just be some old dude with a gray beard.
It isn't a benefit for sure.
Yeah.
I need to stop putting my picture in all the books.
Yeah.
I think you just have to sort of be realistic, because I mean, I think it's a good thing that there's enough readership out there and there's enough of a fan base that they're devouring books and they're like they want more books. Like, that means that someone who puts in a ton of effort and puts out those books that they want every year or as fast as possible can be rewarded for their effort. And I think we see that with someone like Ryan Cahill, who spent an absurd amount of time perfecting his craft and putting all those hours into what did he publish, like 2 million words in 3 years or something?
Yeah, it was
nuts.
Insane. Yeah,
I could never do that. So, but I'm okay with that, because like, I think he's reached the point maybe where he does it full time.
Yeah,
that right there is like, you take a big thing that you have to balance your time with off your plate. If you can focus on this as your full-time job, a book a year suddenly isn't quite as daunting as it was before.
And I think fellow writers miss that point, which is most of us are juggling essentially two jobs. I mean, I do podcasting too, so it's like two part-time jobs on top of a full-time job. Yeah, and I think a lot of people, going back to, kind of the top of the show comparison, I think a lot of people forget that a Ryan Cahill or even a trad published author, a lot of them are full time. They don't have to work 40 hours a week on something irrelevant to the job. Yeah, I think that's really important. I think that gets lost in the conversation pretty often.
Yeah, you just gotta, like we talked about before, only compare yourself to your previous self. If you're putting out books as fast as you can and you're feeling healthy and happy, and you may not be putting out as many books as your readers want, but maybe in some way George R. R. Martin maybe it's helping us in some way, because it's like, look, I put out a book every 18 months or every 2 years. I'm not waiting 11 years to put out my next book.
Yeah, I think some people forget that Martin's been working on this series since the 90s.
Oh, I know.
I don't think they contextualize the timeline that guy operates on. A lot of people who are looking for more immediate gratification forget that this is something he's been working on for decades.
Yeah, and like, to be clear, I have nothing but respect for George R. R. Martin. Like, he was the reason I started writing, so I kind of get it too. His series is extremely complex, and the fact that he has so many other things on his plate now, and perhaps he should be saying no to more things, but who am I to tell him how to live his life? Yeah, I mean, I definitely understand why a book that complex and big and anticipated would take an inordinately long time to write. I could never do it.
And I agree. Sidebar here, you and I both play Elden Ring, and he supposedly contributed to the story, but I've read Martin and I've really deep dived into Elden Ring's story. I don't see any of it. Do you see the Martin in Elden Ring?
I think I do. It's hard to delineate because well, first of all, they never told us what he wrote. So it's all just guesswork and speculation. I see a lot of the themes of just like familial conflict. I think maybe people compare it to A Song of Ice and Fire when they're thinking of like, what did George R. R. Martin write for this story? What does it have in comparison to Game of Thrones in similarity? But George R. R. Martin was like a sci-fi writer for a long time.
Yeah.
He's got a ton of like really weird stories about like hive minds and generational ships and vampires and stuff. Like, he's written it all. And it's all really cool stuff. And I wish I could read more of it. I need more time on my plate to read. But I think if you look at it from that perspective and you realize just how broad of a canvas he's painted on in the past, it becomes a little bit easier to figure out maybe a little bit of what he contributed to Elden Ring.
Yeah, more at a thematic level as opposed to more specifics. I see what you're saying now, because it is essentially like two semi-warring, deified families. So that is an interesting observation. I never really thought about it that way.
Yeah, but it's also intertwined with what the guys at FromSoft did. It's so hard to pick it all out.
Yeah.
Or you could even say like George R. R. Martin wrote this line, but they added stuff into it to like add context. Yeah. It's like, at what point? I mean, he's just like the foundation for the whole game at that point, maybe.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. Once again, I've derailed us. I feel like I'm
okay.
a French resistance during World War II.
I will always talk about Elden Ring.
Okay, good. How many times did it take you to beat Millennia? Who is, by the way, the Blade of Michelin? She's never been defeated. I don't know if you know this or not.
She has been defeated a couple times. So my first playthrough of Elden Ring, I did it at soul level 1. So I didn't level up at all, because I was like, I want to stream this. I want to do a challenge run. I'd been doing like level 1 runs on YouTube for a little while now, in preparation for Elden Ring, because I was like, you can only do it blind once. So I should do it at level 1 blind. And I felt like, honestly, that is part of why it's my all-time greatest game, because there was just so many different options. But by the time I got to Millennia, I was like pretty decked out, still at level 1. But I had damage in my tank. So it took me maybe 200 something times to beat her. It was pretty hard. Wow. It took like 5 or 6 many hour long streams.
Whoa.
But I did the same thing for Bloodborne.
Yeah.
Orphan of Kaz at BL4. I counted it. It took me 21 hours of soul attempts, and it took me 372 times.
Holy
so that one was still harder.
Shit. Wow.
It was hard. I don't know why. I should have been writing. I would have had 4 books out.
Yeah, but you need a break. I think we were talking about it before I hit that big red record button, which is you got to earn your treat. Like I bought Baldur's Gate 3 yesterday, but I didn't play it until I'd done a couple hours of writing. I had a chapter I want to finish so that I start off the new week tomorrow's Monday, start a new chapter or edit. I'm on the fourth draft, so edit at least. But yeah, you got to earn your treat. Okay, let's come back to you. I've never done this much sidebarring and inside baseball, but I'm having a lot of fun, and I hope you are too.
We just got too much in common, man.
I get this problem. I got to find my guests should just be people who are antithetical to my interests. Yeah. Okay, where were we? And I apologize if it happens again.
So the mindset shift for me was really just understanding what I'm capable of. And I think this is something that we were going to talk about a little bit too, is just setting realistic goals. So like for me, I track all of my stats because I think if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So I make sure to, every time I write with a timer on. Sometimes I'm time boxing, just counting down, like I have an hour to write and I'm going to get as much done as I can. Or if I'm lucky, I sit down and make myself comfortable and set the timer to infinite and then just write for as long as I can. And those are always special moments these days. But yeah, just tracking my time spent and my word count and making sure I like attach a note, like what did I do this day? Like today I wrote Grimm chapter 23 for Sibling Sons 2. It makes it really easy to set realistic goals for yourself because then you have all of this data and you're only ever getting more data every day that goes on. I think I have like 3 or 4 years worth of this stuff now. And you can sort of like watch trends and like how fast you're improving or like how you're improving, how fast you're writing. But the thing that's nice about it is you can set realistic goals with that. Like if I see I'm averaging like 10,000 words every month, and maybe one month I had like 20,000 words, but I was a little burnt out after that. Then I can maybe set myself a 15,000 word goal or something, or like a 12,000. Just try and beat my average, but not in like a overblown way or like trying to overdo it. And I feel like in that way, writing is sort of like a muscle. Like the more you use it and the more you work at it, the easier it gets to use, as long as you don't like try and do a 600-pound deadlift and blow out your back, whatever the writing equivalent of that is, which is, I guess, NaNoWriMo.
All right, Josh, goody time here. Let's jump right into it. Seminal books, classes, speeches, all that good stuff. Enlighten aspiring writers with what you've learned.
All right. So my wife has given me the time check, so we're going to speed run this. Yeah. So yeah, seminal books and classes and stuff. So I already mentioned Sanderson's BYU lectures. You should absolutely watch all of those. I think he has several years worth up at this point, and they're always a little bit different. Also, the Writing Excuses podcast I talked about, if you got 15 minutes, it's always a good idea to throw one of those on. And there's some great like one-off YouTube videos I've watched too, like Evan Winter, who's the author of The Rage of Dragons. Love that book. He did an interview with Daniel Green, the Goblin King.
I'm going to get Daniel on here. That's my hope.
Oh, dude, I'll definitely listen to that podcast. They talked about self-publishing and marketing and everything. Really good stuff. Like really inside baseball type stuff, talking about like KDP and like Amazon and Facebook ads and all that stuff. Brian Cahill, we talked about a little bit. He did a video with Library of a Viking, talking about how to become a successful self-published author. Definitely recommend watching that one. Lots of great advice. I also recently read a series of blog posts by Hugh Howey. He's the author of Wool and the creator of the self-published science fiction competition, which I was a judge in last year. His articles cover tons of ground, and if I hadn't already decided to self-publish, they probably would have convinced me that that's the right path. And then, of course, like I said, if you've got a local college that's offering creative writing or self-publishing classes, can't go wrong with that. If you've got the money to spend, you could end up networking and meeting some really good people, and they're close by, so those are most likely the good people that you want to network with and maybe find a writing group.
Awesome. Josh, I really appreciate your time. We got to talk about all the good stuff.
Yeah.
We have too much in common. I've never gone off into the weeds this much, but I had a blast.
We didn't even cover like 30% of the outline that we plan to talk about.
That's fine. We can always have you back on when that next book comes out. We can just make it more informal and we can just shoot the shit.
For sure. Yeah, I'd love to come back.
Excellent. Well, I'm really looking forward to reading more from you, hearing more from you. It's really interesting to see somebody who's younger, is really experiencing this thing in real time, clearly benefiting from it. And your advice, your experience, all of that stuff has just been really beneficial. I think listeners are really going to get a lot from it. And for D&D stuff, great to finally hear somebody give me the correct answer. It is the Paladin. And I appreciate you validating that. Joshua Scott Edwards, man, thank you so much for sharing your preface with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was really fun.
And there you have it, Joshua Scott Edwards. Love talking with him. I'm sure you could tell. I love geeking out on that kind of stuff. It's one of the reasons I think I have a lot of sci-fi fantasy folks on. I try and diversify, but it's my pod, and it's just so much fun to talk about D&D. If you haven't tried it before, it's a great way to practice, I guess you'd call it discovery writing, where you're telling a story as you go, and having a great DM makes all the difference. I just did a really fun one-shot, just play an entire campaign in one go in a couple hours. I really got to flex some of that improv muscle, which was pretty rusty. Been a while since I played D&D, tabletop at least. Mostly just Baldur's Gate, as you already heard. And it was a lot of fun. So if you're into improvising storytelling, you're a discovery writer or outliner, doesn't matter. Like I said, it's a spectrum. You're everything, no matter what you think you are. And try out D&D. There's some cool stuff you can do online too with groups if you don't feel like doing it in person. Really appreciated the conversation about NaNoWriMo. That is something I've been pretty passionate about cautionizing people. I don't know, I just feel like making up words today. It's a Monday. I'm still getting my shit together. Yeah, this idea that you gotta push through and just go full bore. I know I was making some generalizations, but in general, I do believe that that kind of extremist attitude for some people can be detrimental. And I hope, it's my sincere hope, that people who've always wanted to try writing weren't so intimidated and beat up by NaNoWriMo that they never picked the pen back up. I suspect that's happened, and that's a tragedy because everybody deserves to tell their tale and every story deserves to be told. So I want to thank Josh for that opportunity, for letting me step onto my rickety ass soapbox and just nerding out with me. Josh is so much fun to talk with, and all the D&D stuff, I appreciate if you stuck all the way through it. If you're not into that, there were still a lot of great points he made. Comparison and comparing yourself with your previous self. I just thought about that the other night. I was kind of not quite beating myself up, but doing a little bit of comparison with other authors. And I thought about Josh's advice, and I said, well, I did write more than yesterday. It made me feel better, contextualize things. I know I use that word context a lot, but I think it's a watchword for this podcast. So comparing yourself with your prior self, really cool idea. A lot of great resources from him. Speaking of resources, if you want to find out more about Josh and his publications, you can go to joshe.com. So that's Josh followed by the letter E. And I forgot to mention at the top, he's also on Twitter at Josh S. Edwards. If you'd like to find out more about me, Sam Hale, yeah, Hale. That's it on Twitter, Instagram, the Facebooks, Il Face Libro. And then if you'd like to reach out to me, I've had some inquiries about being a guest on the show. You can do that at samhalea@gmail.com. And I will absolutely work with writers across the spectrum. If you're just getting started or you've been published and you've been writing for years, let's talk. The author's preface is about hearing people's experience, no matter where you are on your author's journey. And I'd love to talk with you about it. So thanks again for checking out the show. Got that little mini series I'm working out so I can get some more content out to you. Hopefully share some of my failures and musings. Maybe help some folks out. As an educator, that's always my modus operandi. Education and entertainment. And I hope you got some of that today. But until next time, stay humble, folks.